Hi, I am Ruth Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society, your host for this conversation tonight. And welcome to a conversation about liberty. The Historical Society started this series early in the year, and even before the cascading recent events, we felt that even with our mission and our perspective, which we believed in, there was a need to do more because there was so much that was wrong with our country and our society. And in looking for something to do, we felt that one place we could start is by establishing this series of conversations on difficult topics. There's nothing academic about this now, that's for damn sure. And I want to say a little bit of something as we get going. We are witnessing an object lesson in how ideas about American liberty and freedom are limited and complicated. If you ask someone what it means to be an American, they're likely to tell you it's a free country, but that is hardly an unqualified statement. And Lord knows we're watching that unfold right now. People of African descent, the original inhabitants, women, liberty has never been equally distributed in this country. And that's a mild statement. But it's more than that too. People's ideas of what liberty means are not always shared, and the idea has evolved over time. So in many ways, this could be a very academic conversation, but I suspect in this moment now for all of us, it's likely to be a little more than that. I had some examples about religious liberty and how it is playing out, but they seem almost irrelevant now, so I'm just going to hold them and speak a little bit about what we're trying to do here. We are never looking for consensus. We are not looking to come to some happy conclusion or wrap it up with a bow. We are looking for an opportunity to share our thoughts and beliefs with each other, to listen respectfully, and maybe to learn from that. We don't require that you speak, but if you wish to speak, you will be given the space to do that. We have some rules for conversation. This is our third one of these, and they've been working pretty well, so we're going to try to stick with them again. And these have everything to do with respectful listening and discourse that does not become contentious. So here they are, and as I say every time we do this, they are infinitely familiar to anyone who's been to couples therapy. Say what you yourself think or feel. Start your comments with I believe, or I think, or my experience has been. Sorry, I'm still admitting people if you see me looking away. If responding to someone else, start your comments with that, with I agree with that because, or I disagree with that because. And please keep your remarks as brief as you can make them and still make your point. Our moderators do want to let people speak and not rush them, but they will reserve the right to move things along a little bit when people start to wander. If someone has said something you think is wrong, and that does happen, think about replying by saying something like, there are two sides to that. Let me see if I understand your point of view. Not everyone sees it that way. Or I understand your perspective, but here's what I think. And finally, if someone has said something that you think is offensive more than merely wrong, think about identifying the problem. I can't help but be offended when you say. And then letting others in the group pick up the baton. We'll be all watching for this. and trying to make sure that the conversation keeps moving and doesn't devolve into argument. I want to say we have had some heated conversations in past sessions, but no arguments, no throwing, no fighting, no biting. So let's try to keep with that today. And I'm sorry if I seem a little lighthearted. I am miles away from lighthearted. It's just that when the world is absurd, sometimes all I can do is make a joke. So forgive me for that. I do owe some thanks to folks who helped underwrite this series for us. I want to thank Lisette Prince-Duhamel, Karen Lloyd, and Diana Pearson, who are all here, and also the Zenovation Fund for Community Innovation, all of whom have contributed to our ability to keep this moving forward. All right, now I'm going to introduce our two moderators. Jim Lutus and G. Wayne Miller are the gentlemen who produced Story in the Public Square. Wayne is also a reporter for the Providence Journal, and Jim is also a VP at Salve and head of the Pell Center there. And they are magnificent moderators, and I will turn it over to them. Who wants to go first?
I'm going to defer to the better looking of the two of us. So, Wayne, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, good evening, everyone. And I hope everyone is staying safe and reasonably sane in this insane moment in our history on every level, from the pandemic to George Floyd to what we're seeing in Washington. And it's a very long and very depressing list. So that's my wish for all of you. As we did physically down at the Newport Historical Society, Jim and I will moderate. We'll try to keep things moving along. I will myself try to refrain from pontificating. I can't speak to whether Jim will or not, haha. And so that's basically my role. And one last word, I have been covering the pandemic and related issues for the Providence Journal for quite a long time now. We are working remotely. We have been since the second week of March, mainly from home, but we get out occasionally. Lorraine, of course, I was down to visit today. We get out and do that. And actually, I think I wrote the first story that mentioned the pandemic in January. So it's been a long haul in terms of coverage, but I think we're providing a good public service to our readers, and all of our content related to the pandemic is free. So that's a little plug for my paper, but you know, we're working under stressful conditions and I think doing a good job. So now I'll turn it over to actually my better looking partner, Jim.
You left me with the hard part. So folks, so, you know, let's just dive right into this. You know, the scope for tonight's event is to sort of grapple with these ideas of freedom and liberty and, you know, the boundaries of what that really means. You know, and I think when this started, we were confronted with mobs protesting the streets because they didn't want to deal with the inconvenience of wearing a mask in public. And now we have large mobs in the streets protesting the murder of a man at the hands of the police. And so these issues couldn't be any more timely. I'd like to open the floor to conversation. I think because of the number of people here today, we might be best served using the, actually, I can see everybody on one screen. Never mind, I take that back. So if you got something you want to say, raise your hand. We'll call on you. But let's start off with just this idea of what does freedom mean in 2021? Right? No, it's 2020 still, right? Wishful thinking.
Good
Wishful
Lord.
thinking, yes.
What does freedom mean in 2020 in the American context? Yeah.
Eric, I'll unmute you. Or
Yeah,
unmute
thanks.
yourself.
I did it. Thanks. It's interesting when this started. When I received this email, this began as an email, a topic about liberty, and then it became a discussion about freedom. They are not synonymous. They were not framed as synonymous when the framers sort of did this work. John Locke's sort of second treatise of government doesn't, liberty is not license. And I fear that today too many people feel that liberty is precisely that it's license. It's the freedom to do whatever you want. But liberty, which is theoretically a founding principle, was about freedoms within the context of citizenship, within not just a set of rights, but a set of responsibilities. And I fear, in answer to your question, Jim, what does liberty mean, or what does freedom mean in 2020? I'll bring it back to the context of liberty. I fear today freedom means for many, many people to do whatever you want in any way that you want it to, without any concern about the responsibilities that accompany citizenship. And I'll leave
it's so freedom without responsibilities. That's an interesting contrast, because one of the things that I think is lost often when we have sort of civic conversations in more general audiences, not necessarily tonight because this is a pretty sophisticated crowd, but there's generally a loss of the sense of that as citizens we have responsibilities that is part of living in a republic.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that that's how it should be. I fear that what's happened is, in essence, I mean, as you said in your introductory comments, the freedom to get my hair done, the freedom to get a massage, the freedom to not wear a mask in the elevator in my building because it is oppressive. I agree with you that we need to, that rights and responsibilities need to sort of work together within the context of citizenship. You ask what freedom means in 2020, and I would argue that in America, for a large vocal group of people, it means doing whatever the hell I want, whenever the hell I want it.
And you, I'm guessing, are referencing different rules, which of course vary state by state and even region by region, but rules regarding public health safety.
I would reference the use of guns. I would reference, people's attitudes towards drinking and driving. I'm not limiting this to our current moment. I fear our current moment is in fact a terrible outgrowth of many things, but certainly one is this absolutely reckless opinion about freedom. That was not at all what the framers were thinking about. And I see Ruth has her hand up, so I'm going to mute myself.
As one should. I think that, we can think about that as a profoundly selfish impulse, and it is, but I also think it's tied to a misperception that goes back to the beginning about freedom to versus freedom from. I mean, I have, and obviously the freedom from implies some kind of civic or group responsibility or good. And in one place or another, here in Rhode Island, we are culturally pointed towards individual liberties, my freedom too. Much more than we are to the idea that others might have freedom from. And this plays out in almost any arena in guns. My freedom to carry a gun compared to someone else's freedom not to be terrorized. One could argue, and people have done, that the Civil War was fought over freedom on both sides. My freedom to enslave people for my economic benefit versus someone else's right to be free from being enslaved. I mean, this is a conflict that goes back to the beginning, and we have not sorted it out in any way that's useful.
Well, I would say that what we're seeing playing out day by day is not encouraging, that we're going to get to a better common ground. Frankly, before the pandemic, I've had doubts. I just wonder if this is ever going to be a dream realized. And pardon me if I'm a little bit pessimistic on that issue, but certainly is not going to happen in the foreseeable future under present conditions. Ruth, someone has a
Yes,
hand
sir.
up?
From the Rhode Island slave history. I don't know your name, sir.
Charles.
Charles.
Charles, can you? Oh, I'm going to unmute you. Here you go.
Oh, okay. You know, unfortunately, when you start something from a base of hypocrisy, and then you build on a base of hypocrisy, and you justify the hypocrisy, and I'll just basically just talk about slavery as the original sin of Rhode Island, of the United States, or the colonies. When you base it on that hypocrisy, it's hard to turn it back around once you've kind of made an error like that, a huge error like that, of use and abuse through domination and control. Even if at that time it was a necessary, I would call it a necessary evil, because how else were they needed slaves to develop the United States as it is now? The Indians wouldn't work because it was basically their country, and they were being suppressed in their own location. So slaves were brought in to do the work, because let's face it, if you don't know the environment, you can't run away. I've seen this in South America when I worked in Venezuela, and I see it here. So once, as I said, and I'll just end that, once you start down a road, a slippery slope, and you continue it, and then you create, impact it with false narratives to justify it, it's very hard to come back.
Loren.
Hello. Hi, Charles.
Hey.
So I agree with what Charles is saying, but I think it goes one step further in the idea that this country is founded on capitalism and conquest. And so when you start something and you're from the very beginning wreaking genocide and slavery and oppression, all in the point of monetary gain, that's the problem. And we don't change our system. So because our system is still in essence the same, it's still about hierarchy and who can be at the top, and the 1% that has the majority of the wealth, and then 90% or 99% that does not have the wealth. And that's part of the problem. And when we keep seeing the things that are happening, it's because of this disparity in economics and the drive for wealth and power in this country.
And of course, these disparities run deep in many other areas, as we were talking about this morning down at Tomahawk, in terms of education, in terms of opportunity, and the list is long there too.
So folks, I know you're chatting, and I appreciate that, but I want to ask some of you to say out loud what you've written down as well, if that's all right with my moderators.
Well, in fact, I was just gonna lift right from there and
Okay.
force people to acknowledge what they've said in private here. So there's this discussion that you guys have been having, Diana and Matt, and I think Brian too, about this notion about whether or not we've lost respect for one another. And is that a necessary precondition for? Well, let's use the classical term liberty. Do we have to respect one another to recognize our rights and our individual liberties?
Matt.
At least that.
One of the things that I'm finding in our society today is that people are so concerned about getting what they want out of the world at anybody else's cost. We've lost respect for the environment. We've lost the respect for our fellow people. I joke with my students every day I go into school, and I tell my students when I go in, I'm like, I woke up this morning with hope in humanity, and then I got in the interstate. Everybody has to get someplace first. Everybody's more important. I mean, we're sitting here in a quarantine, and I got people cutting me off. Where are you going?
Yeah.
What's so important? And this idea that, your rights are okay until they infringe upon the rights of others. And that's something that a lot of people just don't get. It's like, I love my guns, but if my fellow citizens are afraid of my guns, then maybe I need to address that situation and work with them to make to make it so that's not the case.
So
That
is
both sides get something out of it.
the question? Sorry, Mac. Go ahead.
No, that's okay.
So we have two hands up. Lexington Historical Society.
Go ahead.
I was going to agree with you, and I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot as people were saying earlier about these various original sins in our society that all sort of come together, and one of them is this very overly intense sense of individualism that really makes everything else worse. That if you have a society that was already built on inequality of personal wealth and personal worth, and you add to that this sense that is started from hundreds of years ago, the idea that it is every person for himself, and that the good of the individual is more important than the good of the group, then how can you come back and actually have that sense of community that we're all asking for? To say, how can we think of the group if that's never really been a part of our society, that we have this American exceptionalism idea of all of these Daniel Boones on the frontier who chop down entire forests by themselves.
Elizabeth, I unmuted you.
Thank you. I definitely agree with the general sentiment, sort of the description of where we're at, but I disagree with the idea that we've lost respect. Because 50, 100 years ago, personally, I don't think we had more respect for the environment, more respect for difference of different ways of living, different kinds of people. And it sort of goes back to a topic that I think was from our original in-person Civic Conversations meeting about, is it useful to have an ideal? What kind of society that we want? And I think it's important to have a goal and sort of a vision of respect, of community. But as Charles said earlier, if you start out the system on sort of with unequal power relations, with institutionalized power hierarchies, I just don't think that our goals should be tied to the past in that way. I think we need, that sort of constrains the future that is possible in our minds and in reality.
I don't know. Can you hear me talking? This is Mrs. Johnson. Can you hear me talking?
We can.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
You can?
Yes.
Okay. I tried before and then it just came through. I have to go back to that question called freedom and liberty. And for me, slavery, when it was abolished, gave us just freedom, never gave us liberty. And that's the way I have to think about it. And sometimes liberty was given to not my ancestors, but the descendants, because of the fact that we demanded it. We demanded the respect and the capability of who and what we were and how hard we worked for it. And people would then look at us in a different light. And thus, I had not just freedom to speak the way I wanted to. They also gave me that liberty to say that. Now, 350, 400 years ago, 200 years ago, that was not true. And when you asked me for freedom and liberty, that's the way I have to look at it.
So I guess what I want to tease that out just a little bit, Mrs. Johnson, because what you're saying is, I think, really insightful and very provocative. But you're drawing, it seems like you're drawing a distinction between freedom and liberty, in which liberty is about your standing before the law. Is that an accurate statement, or am I reading too much into that? Liberty is about.
I think you're a little too much for that, for the law. I'm just talking every common day life. Like, for example, I am now free. But if I walk down the street and I do something that's not right, or if I do something that they think is not right, and I don't have the liberty.
Okay.
You've got 2 raised hands. You've got 3 raised hands, gentlemen.
Why don't we go to Loren?
Well, I was thinking about what Mrs. Johnson was saying, and I think it's the idea that I have the freedom to drive down the road, but I don't have the liberty when I'm being, what's the word, when they're tracking certain community groups, and we call it DWI, driving while Indian, and you get pulled over.
We call it driving while black. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You're not doing anything wrong. So that's where, for me, I'm free to drive down the road, but I don't have the same liberty that everyone else.
nailed it.
I have
You
to be
nailed it.
extra good at everything I do, because even the slightest impropriety, even if it's not even wrong, can be construed as wrong. And that's where the liberty is taken away. When we were talking about George Floyd, his liberty was taken away, his life was taken away. And part of that was he wasn't presumed innocent first. People that have liberty are presumed innocent first. People that don't have liberty are presumed guilty first.
There's those full rights of citizenship, the full rights and expectation of citizenship that are not equally conferred across the board.
Exactly.
And obviously that's been true since day one, before day one.
Mhm.
Why don't we go to Brian? He's had his hand up.
Hello,
We got to unmute you, Brian.
Brian, unmute.
Brian, hold on. I'm unmuting you, or I'm trying.
You unmuted me, Ruth. I'm going to mute myself again.
Oh, okay. This list keeps shifting around. Brian, you can unmute. Oh, here you are. Okay, got you.
So
Yeah.
can you guys hear me now then?
We
Yes.
can.
Yes.
So I was going to say, I think that I think Lauren's very right. And I was also going to say, I think this, capitalistic, individualistic, top-down approach that this country's always been built on has really, created some real boundaries, like even before the pandemic, like how we can accomplish like healthcare that we, people feel like, it's my right whether to choose whether I have insurance or not. We haven't been able to figure out universal healthcare. We can't get, big federal level infrastructure projects like high-speed rail or anything like that kind of done and I feel that there's a certain element among certain, like in white America, I guess mostly in white America, that we feel like any of these collective projects are going to take away like my rights. And so like, say if we, make a super fast to sell a train between Boston and, Washington, then you're going to like take away my right to drive a car. It just always seemed like there's always been any time that there's these big time collective projects like that or universal health care that people felt that, they're going to get something taken away from them if we give to something, that's bigger for the collective good or and even when it comes to like climate change too.
I think history has shown us at least one example where we were able, during a very difficult time, to accomplish things together as a nation. Of course, that would be during the Great Depression with the WPA, which built bridges, and with the birth of social programs. And I'm sure we've all read that out of the current pandemic, there should be or could be an opportunity to do something similar. And on the other issues you mentioned, including healthcare, which is an issue very dear to my heart, but it's not happening, clearly. Who else had a hand up?
Fred Zillian.
Can we unmute Fred?
I'm working on it.
Okay.
Fred and Eric, too. I know Eric's got his hand up, too.
Eric does? Okay.
Okay, Fred, you're unmuted.
Sometimes I have audio problems. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, good. Lots of good comments. I've been working in this area on citizenship, rights and duties, civility for 3 or 4 years. The last 3 or 4 years, in addition to with my colleagues here, Charles Roberts and Mrs. Jay, Rhode Island slave history, these have been my 2 most important areas of focus. So I would like to echo and applaud the comments initially made by the gentleman from Newport Restoration. Yeah,
It's Eric.
Eric. I just got Newport Restoration.
Yeah, sorry.
So in my work, did indeed come down to what he and perhaps others have said. We have to talk about, if you want to talk about citizens, you have to talk about both rights and responsibility. But, and I would place it back to the good old 60s when I was a teenager and then in my college years, the crazy 60s. It seems like rights since then have been elevated. Identity politics has been elevated. And less there has been emphasis on the common good. What obligations, what duties do I have as a citizen? So I would also agree with those folks that have made that point. I think, Jim, you were talking about respect, and is respect necessary? Can you still hear me? Hello? Yes?
Yes, but you are
You
breaking
fade
up
in.
a little.
Yeah, you fade in and out.
Okay. Sorry. I would say respect is closely allied with civility. That's the concept I've been working with. And if we were in North Korea, or perhaps Cuba, or maybe Hungary now, we'll see, respect and civility is not that important. But if you want to run a democracy, I've found civility, respect is very necessary, so that we, just like we're doing today, we are listening to one another and not simply immediately putting people into pegs, holes. Well, he's an African American, he's a Jew, he's an Irishman, and then we don't get much done. Thank you.
We got Eric.
Yeah. So this takes us back a few steps, but I wanted to sort of continue a thought that Elizabeth raised that I think is important for us to think about. And I've noticed it more since I've moved to New England. I spent almost 30 years in Los Angeles. I was raised in New York. I'm a historian by training. And, you know, Elizabeth spoke about founding principles and the way in which they, you know, these original sins. I think it was Jim Wallace that called racism America's original sin. One of the things that tears at our society today and annoys the crap out of me as a historian is the way in which we have fetishized our history and the way in which we have fetishized our founders, as if somehow these people were perfect, as if their brilliance sort of had no downside to them, as if everybody was amazing. And you know, I continue to be stunned that when I came to New England, people who fought on the side of America in the Revolution are called patriots, as opposed to any other thing, right? They might be revolutionaries. To the Brits, they were, of course, the thugs that Donald Trump is talking about today. So we have, because Americans don't read history, they don't study history, they don't care about history, their textbooks don't really tell you history. We look to history as a blueprint for the future here in America, when in fact that may not be the best idea in the world. As somebody quoted Rabbi Heschel earlier, and that was really nice to see. My doctorate's in American Jewish history. But there's another American Jew who I think wrote Mordecai Kaplan, who founded Reconstructionism, who said of tradition versus modernity that the past is entitled to a vote, but it's not entitled to a veto. And too often in America, I think we look to not just the past, but a specific white colonial past, and we give it the right to veto things. And that idea very often comes from people utterly ignorant of what was going on in colonial America. And so I think our obsession with an exceptional past does great violence to the notion of freedom in the 21st century in any constructive and meaningful way. And I'll leave it there.
I see Matt has his hand up.
And I think Charles might have been first, though, from the Newport.
That was Charles.
No, that was Eric.
Oh, that's Eric, sorry. Okay, who is next?
Charles from,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
still want to speak?
I must say I really appreciate. First of all, I want to appreciate the people that that are here. I mean, your consciousness and your sensibility about the subject matter makes me feel really good, because as an African American that has actually gone through some of the injustices by the police department, even though my father was a police officer, to see the sensibility that's coming out and the understanding and the compassion that you guys are expressing by what you say makes me really feel good. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be raised as a townie in Milburn Short Hills, where really racism, we were raised in racism, but we were all during the 50s, you know, I had Irish and Italian and Jewish friends, and all of us worked together. And because we worked together, in spite of the environment, we all succeeded. And this is what I'm not seeing now. I see such a polarization of ideals that young people are actually being hurt by it. They don't know themselves. They haven't studied their history, so they don't know where they've come from. So they don't have a place to stand so that they can take a stand. And it's been said, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. And so I think that, and I'm happy for everyone here, that here I am amongst people that are conscious enough to want to try to help make an opportunity to bring people together to go somewhere in a positive way. The polarization's got to stop.
So Charles, in essence, and stop me if you think I'm making too much of this, the past is not a blueprint for the future. It can't be, because it's filled with the worst of horrors. But there are some things about the past that let us know that better things are possible.
Oh, I would totally agree with you. But it's the people that I've met that made it that way. I've met other people that haven't been so nice to me and been, to say the least.
Not gonna be.
Yeah, all right, just a little, like the handcuffs weren't too bad, but at least I knew my father could come and get me, where others haven't been as fortunate. And I you know, you want to talk about maybe white privilege, because it's very difficult unless you've known a Black person or been in that kind of circumstance to understand where they're coming from. You know, to empathize with a person that is ignorant. It doesn't. They're not criminals. They just don't have the experience that you might have had, and are the opportunity that you might have had to see from another perspective. And if we can provide that other perspective, we can make a change.
We're gonna go to Brian in a moment here, but I want to plant a seed for later in this conversation. But I would invite everybody to think about in your own life, in your own experience, what is the greatest threat to your own personal liberty and your own personal freedom? And maybe we won't poll everybody, but anybody who wants to volunteer and reflect a little bit on that. In your life today, what is the greatest threat to your liberty or the greatest threat to your freedom? Maybe we'll talk about that as a group. But Brian, pick up with your thought.
Okay. Oh, can you guys hear me now?
We can.
Yep, now we can.
Sorry about that. So I was just thinking about actually an experience, this experience of people saying about the past, a guest, so that they didn't know any better to try to justify like colonialism and slavery. This happened to me with a woman that when I was interpreting at the Colony House back in February as part of the Henrietta Overing and the Wedding Expo event. I was like, you know, trying to work with her to try to show that that's not. But how do you think that this concept got, you know, rooted among, you know, especially among white Americans, that this idea that of justifying these, you know, great sins of the past like slavery without more for the professional historians here, like, how do we get to this point that we're trying to justify that? And I know that that's not true, because if you look at like what George Washington did with, moving the people he enslaved in and out of Philadelphia during his, to be able to avoid any kind of emancipation laws. I mean, I totally think, they really did know better. But I'm just wondering, where do you think that this myth got its start?
Matt has his hand up.
Brian, I'm going to refer to Brian, and then Eric from Newport. Is that? And then Charlie. Just so you know a little bit about my background, I'm a military historian, and usually I study why people kill each other, which means I'm very cynical. But talking about, yeah, I know. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that I noticed that race and hypocrisy are a major part of American history. I started my doctoral dissertation studying British military operations from Canada, and I've now moved to discussing about how the entire American Revolution was basically about race. My research showed me that the American Revolution started by oppressed Scotch-Irish who moved from Ireland to escape oppression, and the colonial system gave them the opportunity to oppress somebody else, which was the Native Americans on the frontier. So the loss of British legitimacy was on the frontier, and that spread to eventually Boston when they saw that nobody was going to do anything if you killed a native. What are they going to do if we throw some tea in a lake or, the ocean? Our entire history is based on the hypocrisy of race, because it's not only the story of African Americans and how they were enslaved, but our entire history is this narrative of taking land away from somebody else and justifying it. Our history, our mythology is trying to hide what our history is really about. And I think we're moving to a point where, as the white portion of our population gets smaller, the reality of our history is coming out. And people are not happy with that, because it shows the narrative that is not a nice narrative. We are hypocrites. Why do you think people hated Lincoln so much? Because when he talked about slavery, he put the knife in a Southerner and then he twisted it through truth. And that's what we're experiencing now. And it's been the story. And again, I started out trying to do a general military history of the British and on the frontier, and I've ended up realizing there's a whole nother story there that is way more important. And sorry, I went into professor mode. I haven't talked to anybody in 2 months in person.
Happy to be of service. Lizette has a hand up, gentlemen.
Thank you. Well, something that Brian, the gentleman called Brian, said a while back really touched me, because it concerns capitalism and it concerns the environment. And that's, he mentioned the environment and climate change. Now, I would like to be free of smog. Thank God for the brief moment that we've had when airplanes are not going and cars aren't going. And oh my goodness, all of a sudden, you can see, the sky, especially in places like in India and in some of the most polluted places in the world. I mean, we're a little bit lucky because we've got the Clean Air Act, which Mr. Trump wants to, never mind, but he wants to get rid of. I was going to say something much ruder. But so here's a capitalist system says that so-and-so has got the right to build a business, and if this business needs to pollute the air, so be it, because he gets to run this business. Whereas us, we'd like to kind of not die a premature death. If you're not very rich and you have to live next to a highway, and you end up dying at a very young age. Where's their freedom, for example? So, I mean, I think that, people say capitalism is not perfect, but it's the best that we've got. But I think that people have abused of capitalism. And then luckily now there are some people who are turning to something called a B corporation. And you have to, be admitted to be a B corporation, which means that you have to do good. You can do well by doing good. And so your bottom line is not the end all and be all. You have to do the right thing. The one that started it is Patagonia. And now we have people in Rhode Island, lots of them, are also now B corporations. And the way you can find out more about that is through a social greenhouse enterprise, which is run by Kelly Ramirez. And they have a lot of these B corporations, and they're helping each other to do well. So there's hope, but we've got to train people. Education.
Lizette, what your remarks remind me though of you know there are challenges, great challenges about equity in the United States today. Equity, economic equity, equal opportunity in terms of the opportunities we have, but also even in things like healthcare. We look at this at some of the statistics around the current pandemic, and what's so stunning to me is the fact that the outcomes are so much worse for people of color. And it's not just about the color of their skin, it's about the economic circumstances they found themselves in before, the chronic health conditions that they have suffered with and lived with because of lack of access to health care. And so, you know, one of the I'm self-editing so that I don't make just a terribly political statement, but one of the great tragedies of the last decade was the reframing of the debate over universal access to healthcare as a debate around you were free to die, but you weren't free if you had government healthcare. And that just seemed to be, at least to me, a pretty stark kind of freedom, that we could be free to die, but we couldn't be free if we had government-sponsored healthcare. That's my soapbox moment.
Yeah, but you know what? May I just chip in right here just for a second? One of the problems is that these people who don't have a lot of money, and both white and black, but I think both, I think the American African probably, you know, there are more people who suffer from income inequality. So they go to these stores that are, you know, usually these convenience stores because they live in a food desert, and they buy crap. They buy absolute junk, and of course then they get these, you know, diabetes and all these things. So again, it's education. And if you look at MLK Center right here in Newport, they're teaching little kids how to cook.
Yeah.
So that when they go home, they can show their parents what's a better way of cooking. I always like to look at the hopeful part.
Loren had her hand up a little while ago. Loren, can we hear what you wanted to say? I know there's been some chatting going on in the background here.
You've got two more too, just to get on your radar screen.
You know, I agree. So I'm going to say a couple of things. The thing is, if those people that know me, I have 2 degrees in education, so I think education is important. However, with that being said, it's also a system of oppression, and that communities of color, the system that has been set up so that they have unequal education, and they have the school to jail pipelines that are happening. There's disproportionate numbers of communities of color that don't graduate from high school, that are pushed into special education, that are disproportionately punished and suspended from school. You know, I spend a lot of my time on commissions for the Rhode Island Department of Education on the disproportionality that is taking place. And it's systemic. And so even though education is an important tool to help people, you know, rise up out of poverty, it's also part of the problem and the way that it's done. People are not included in the narrative. When you go in most classrooms, not all, but most classrooms, when they teach about American history, everyone else is excluded. And if they bother to even say anything about it, it's usually in the frame of complete conquest and in Native American perspective, then we're all gone. On the East Coast, we're gone in the 1600s, and on the West Coast, we're gone after the 1800s, and we don't exist. We are not represented as giving any contribution to this country in any kind of way from that point on. And that's true for many immigrant groups in diverse communities, and whether it's LGBTQ or new immigrant populations. it's a systemic process that continues to happen to subjugate the next group of people. And the reality is you haven't undone it for the groups from before fully.
Right.
And so when we go back to the terms of freedom and liberty, if you haven't given it to groups, I mean, in the case of indigenous people that were here before this even became a country fully, you're certainly not really inclined to do it for new waves of immigrant populations. And unfortunately, if those immigrant populations are brown, they are more so to be subjugated and chastised. One of the conversations that we were having over here in the chat was about breeding fear and hate. For me, they're part of the conquest. You know, you use the rhetoric to make everyone else afraid. So when I made a comment in there about greed, the greed is the conqueror, the people with the power. The need are the people in waves that follow behind them. That's the average immigrant from any country that's coming to the United States. And they are given that rhetoric to be afraid of the people that the people in power are trying to conquer, so that they're fearful and are hateful and join the ranks of killing people out of that fear and rhetoric that's been portrayed. We're seeing it happening in the news and in the media and in the rhetoric that's being thrown around right now. I mean, everybody from South America, according to someone we know, is all rapists and murderers. That's the rhetoric that creates fear and hate. And it's incessant and it's insidious.
It's that same dynamic in a way, you know, the freedom to speak and the freedom from hate speech are in conflict with each other.
Exactly. And that's the trick of the whole thing. The reason why this is so difficult, because as Americans, we all want our freedoms fully engaged, but where's the line when one person loses their freedom while someone else gains theirs? And it tends to be the people that have the most power can gain freedoms that hurt another whole group of people.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
Elizabeth has her
Elizabeth
hand up.
Mendenhall.
Thanks. I don't want to detract from the focus on systemic, structural, institutionalized oppression. I think it's really important that we're talking about things like the education system, for example. But I've been thinking about Jim's question about what's the biggest threat to my personal freedom and liberty. And I think it's sexual violence. I change my behavior every day to avoid street harassment, sexual assault, and rape. And I'm also not trying to elevate gender-based oppression over other things that we've been discussing, but I think that, you know, reflecting on my own experience, what stands out to me is that one of the mechanisms through which living in the society that we do decreases my freedom or liberty is the way I change my behavior. And it becomes unthinking a lot of the time. And so there are instances where it's very obvious that a person is, you know, being disadvantaged by the system. You know, you can see it in paychecks, you can see it in rates of police violence, et cetera. But there's all this sort of less visible stuff happening as we just change our behavior in our daily lives because of the world we've grown up in.
Diana, I know that you've been waiting patiently.
Well, Elizabeth, thanks for throwing the ball into another answer to Jim's question, which is kind of what's our greatest fear or threat right now. Mine's really election day. I mean, our system, is everything so broken, number one, that we got the guy we have, and number two, that we might get him again. That's my greatest fear, election day. Who's going to be allowed to vote? Who's going to go out to vote? Who's going to be able to use an absentee ballot? Are there enough people who think the way that many of us think? That's my greatest fear. Will our system work?
You know, Diana, one of my questions that grows from that is there's a wonderful book that I recommend to everybody when I get the chance to do it. It's by Edward Luce. Wayne and I had him on the show a year or 2 years ago. It's called The Retreat of Western Liberalism. And you know, one of the things that I think is often lost in popular discussions of these issues is that we created government. It's in the Constitution. You create governments among people to protect liberties, to protect rights. Governments exist to protect rights, because if left to the world of nature, the Enlightenment thinkers that believed that life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So we organize ourselves, and we organize free institutions to protect those liberties and those rights in terms of how we organize our society. Do you have confidence? What I'm hearing from you is that you don't, but I wonder if you could articulate why you don't have faith in those free institutions today to protect those rights in the current environment.
Whether it's the Electoral College, how this happened to begin with, and whether there is so much interference, so much noise that it's just going to happen again. Because I don't think our system kind of protected us last time around. And whether it's Pete Buttigieg, who has an original idea and says we have to change the Electoral College, that system, you just don't sort of hear enough attention to a lot of the steps we need to take, whether it's COVID and sort of the 5 steps to ensuring safety in this society. People aren't sort of focused on, well, how do we get back to where we need to be?
So I think one of the big factors, one of the compounding factors here in this entire discussion, and certainly going back many years, is disinformation that is intensified during the Trump era. And Jim has written and knows more than I do about Russian bots and Russian interference. What do you folks think about that? I mean, have we reached the point with social media, with disinformation, with enemies of the people, and so forth, that perhaps it's not possible to actually have a constructive common ground? We have a number of hands up. Brian, you've got your hand up.
I think the death of the I've witnessed it myself. I'm a former journalist. I got laid off in April from Kingston, New York. The Daily Freeman. We're owned by a media news group, company Alden Capital, a company notorious for killer of newspapers. But
yeah,
I think
I'm sadly familiar with them. I'm sorry.
I think that's I mean, journalism, what I've seen is not perfect. There's certainly, like maybe not a diversity in the newsroom, at least that I've known of, that's reflected our community. And, journalism can actually be an issue, though, like how the media frames events, say like in Minnesota. But I think that the keeping your local newspaper, that third estate there, because the local newspaper is where all news starts, is local. If we let like hedge funds and stuff kill our local newspapers, I think we're in serious trouble. I mean, everybody loves to hate on their local fish wrapper, as my friend who used to work for Gannett down in Yonkers, and he actually started his career at the Providence Journal, like as just working like around in the office and being like a gopher basically. But I think that we could be in serious trouble if we do let this system of news gathering go and just only depend on whatever people post on Facebook or whatever these cable news channels say, because they're and even television news in general. I mean, there's the idea of Trinity Broadcasting, the conservative Christian empire, like buying out the stations owned by Tegna, the local TV stations. Now, this isn't going through immediately, but like think of the implications of that when a powerful group can purchase something like, say, network affiliates, which is where most people get their news, and be able to, use that to further agenda. I mean, we've seen that most recently with the infamous Amazon warehouse package.
Yeah, I would even push that one step further, because we know that there are emerging news deserts, where Lizette mentioned the food deserts, but there are news deserts as well, where local journalism just no longer exists.
And those numbers of deserts are growing. Again, we had a guest on, Penny Abernathy, who spoke at.
And the danger there isn't just sort of the infiltration of ideological based news sources, but you stop having somebody to report on what are the school systems doing, what is the city hall doing, what are the local police officers doing. it's the essential oversight of a free press that is gone if those newspapers cease to exist. Ruth, I saw you have your hand up, and then Eric, I see you do too.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about, we are cataloging the societal ills that we're aware of, and this is healthy venting. But I want to ask a question about why, I mean, we mentioned at the beginning that we have a culture that is intensely devoted to individual liberty and very little interested in the collective good, the freedom from part of the equation. And certainly capitalism gets wrapped up into that pretty easily. And, beyond just saying, these are all the ways we're screwed, I'm wondering if we can ask ourselves a little, sorry, I've been alone a lot. We're lucky I didn't curse words. I'm wondering if we can ask ourselves a little bit, are there flaws in our conception of what we're supposed to be and who we're supposed to be that are helping to accelerate these really negative developments?
In addition to the loss of sort of a freely spirited media, right?
Mm-hmm. Because I think that's part and parcel, right? If corporations have the freedom to make money in any way possible, then the local newspaper is of no interest, right?
Yeah.
If that's the core freedom.
I saw Timothy put his hand up, and I saw Lizette put her hand up on that.
Sure, thanks. I think at its core, one of the things that perpetuates this is insecurity at the individual level and at the group level. And with that comes my earlier reference to Heschel. I am a privileged human being, right? I'm well educated. I have a job that didn't go away and pays me. I'm white, I'm male, I'm straight, that's why I haven't talked for a while, because I wanted to hear other voices. But it also means having clear eyes when you think about the starting places that each of us have and the vulnerability that each of us feels, right? The things I worry about economically might seem pretty trite to someone who's pretty close to starving, but they're meaningful to me. And then I know that there are advantages that have come my way that have not come to other people, and they are generational advantages, right? And being a person who's involved in conservation, I know the root of that word is the same as the root of conservative, and that things are worth perpetuating that would otherwise vanish as a flip side, which is things that have been perpetuated that are holding us back need to come down. So I'm quite happy about the Confederate monuments coming down in Virginia right now. Even as a historian who thinks there are ways to interpret the past differently, those things are artifacts. But identity is wrapped up in this, and vulnerability is wrapped up in this. And until we can kind of get past that to say, we're not starting at equal places, and that's wrong. And we do have responsibility for each other, and that's important. We're going to be defensive, and we're going to be stuck. That's what I had to say.
Super. Lizette? All right, they're going to unmute you. Just a second.
There we go.
Oh,
there you go.
Good.
There
You're
you
good now,
are.
Lizette.
Well, just very briefly, because I'm about to lose my juice. I used to be in the newspaper business most of my life. The last one being Newport This Week. And I know that it is about money. Newport This Week survives with advertising. Now, Washington Post is very lucky because a millionaire, billionaire jumped in, Mr. Bezos. New York Times is doing well, those big guys. The local ones have a much harder time, so then the Daily News got gobbled up by the same people that bought the Providence Journal. So the good news is, if you want to have a local press, you can. what you do is you're going to donate to Newport this week. Because, no, seriously, they're going not for profit, which is the way to go.
Yeah.
So you buy in to get your news. I mean, you buy cable to get television. So, and all the best publications are not for profit, like National Geo, for example. But I'll just quickly add by saying education. But what about a woman like Val Deming that I was reading about? She grew up dirt poor, and now she's being considered to be a vice president for Biden. And you follow her career, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, she's African American. I forgot to say that.
Eric, you've had your hand up for a while. Did you want to chime in?
Well, I mean, sure, but now there's like 5 things I was thinking about, so I'll leave those to the side, and do sort of 2 things, I think. So one is sort of thinking about Wayne's question about disinformation, misinformation, fake news, the news environments. Some of the podcasters who I've been listening to over the past couple of years have made a really sort of important point that, the internet as a source of information for all of us is still brand new. We have no idea if we're doing it right, and my guess is we're not. And so a lot of because in essence, Ruth, I think the answer to your question of why is by and large either innate selfishness or cultivated ignorance, right? That we believe we know things now, right? And part of the reason that our ignorance is so, we're so confident in our ignorance is that we can point to this massive global library that most of us are using completely wrong, right? I stopped, after the 2016 election, I stopped getting my news from cable television because I think the 24-hour news cycle means that all news is entertainment. And I stopped getting my news from any sort of Facebook sources because clearly the stories I was reading about Hillary's guaranteed election must have been wrong. And now I've gone back to an older way of gathering information, which is I read the newspaper once a day. I check in with my friends on Facebook to see if they're posting anything from the Atlantic or the Nation or something, a diverse range of sources, and then I walk away because what else am I could scroll endlessly, and am I contributing to my intelligence? No, I actually think I'm contributing to my ignorance. I think I become less free the more freedom to this information I have. And I'll leave it there.
I think that's very well put. Outstanding point. Fred has a hand up.
I do.
Mrs. Johnson does, Fred does, Charles does.
Thank
We have a lot of hands up.
You do, huh? I don't know if you can hear me or not because I was unmuted and then muted and then unmuted. But at any rate,
we've got you.
Yeah.
Listening to this entire conversation and having been a teacher and still working with students, specifically high school students, but the college kids come back to me too. And also knowing that the last 15, 16 years, I've done everything I could for the NAACP to hire teachers of color. And it has not happened. Did you hear me? 15, 16 years have been before the school committee. And every time, nepotism in the city of Newport wins. Go before them, give them information, everything you could possibly imagine. And I believe in the entire city of Newport, we may have 5 people of color. A Native American Indian, maybe two African Americans, one's a doctor now, and some Hispanics. And then I look at our students and the ones that I go down there to see and work with, they get it better than any of us do. You may not realize it, but those kids, and especially the ones at Rogers High School, I'm not talking Portsmouth, I'm not talking Middletown, that's why they need to regionalize. I'm talking about Rogers High School. Those kids play sports together, those kids socialize together, they study together, they go to classes together, they do everything together. I don't even think they even think about who their best friends are anymore. So I have to look to that future, and everything that you all were talking about, those kids are going to make that change.
I agree 100%. I often say that one thing that gives me hope is faith in young people. And I think we are seeing that across the country now in terms of the George Floyd rallies. There's one tomorrow, I think at 5 o'clock, Kennedy Plaza in Providence, organized by 14 and 15 and 16-year-old students from Providence. And I'm not going to go on at great length, but it does give me hope that we have young people who are getting it.
I'll be just a little.
Getting it.
So you know, the only thing I would say is they better vote.
Well, these kids can't vote just yet, but you know what?
I know, but as soon as they turn 18, if they had voted in 2016, the last 4 years would have been vastly different. And if they had voted in 2000, the last 20 years would have been vastly different. And so I hear what you're saying, and I want to believe they better vote.
Support. I'm not saying vote for Bernie, but I'm saying help him in his quest to get those kids, because that's what he's doing. He's getting the young college kids.
So the issue of participation in our republic is it's as serious as it gets. If you look at just raw numbers and who votes and who doesn't vote, you know, all of the disinformation that Wayne mentioned that we've all documented and we've all read about and we've all worried about in 2016, the vast majority of that disinformation was about suppressing the vote. And voter suppression is a tried and true tactic about changing the politics, about keeping certain people in power and certain people out of power.
True.
And the only way you bust that is by turning out numbers of people that have never voted before. And that's where the young people are so matter. But that's why when I look at the rates of electoral participation, or I look at Yasha Mounk's research out of Harvard that says that the younger you are, the further you are away from the World War II generation, the more comfortable you are considering living in a society that's not organized as a democracy. Mm-hmm. That terrifies me.
Yeah.
You have
Brian,
a couple of hands raised.
We had I think Loren and then Brian.
And Lexington Historical.
So I'm sort of back a couple of conversations ago on the internet, and I agree with what everyone's saying, that it is, you know, our nemesis in the sense of the disinformation that's out there. But I do want to say that when things like Standing Rock were happening, without the internet, there would have been no press whatsoever on the issues that were happening there. And that tends to be true with underserved communities. And so it feels a little bit frustrating that I personally believe power brokers are pushing out the disinformation. And yes, uninformed people help perpetuate it, but it's really people with power that are feeding the populace this disinformation. And that's a way to also eliminate any access to these truths that are out there that are not getting heard in the mainstream media from underserved communities.
I would just agree with Loren on that. I mean, one of the things that really plagued me was that in this day and age, that we would have a president that would take away the Wampanoag rights, their treaty in Massachusetts, and it'd only be a blip of information in the newspaper, and then you hear nothing else about it. I mean, how can you expect us to have a civil society of laws when you have a president that is actually breaks the law and takes away a treaty? It's, you know, it's unprecedented, and then you hear about it, and then because it isn't popular in the media, you don't hear about it anymore.
Yeah. So, folks, we are running rapidly out of time here. I know that we have our friend from the Lexington Historical Society has been waiting very patiently. I want to hear from her, and I know that Brian had his hand up too. We want to get those two comments, and then we're going to wrap it up. So, Lexington, over to you. Not yet. The mute button is coming to you, or the unmute button, as the case may. There you go.
You go.
Well, first of all, I just want to say you might hear some honking in the background. We're actually on day 2 of demonstrations on the battle green here. So that's kind of a glorious cacophony of car horns and chanting as I've been listening. So part of me is glad that I've been on mute and part of me isn't, because I think it's a nice backdrop to this. But having come off of doing school programs today, which is why I'm dressed like this, it's something, as we were talking about teaching the next generation, that's been very heavily on my mind the last few days. I've been teaching 5th graders, and they have been asking wonderful questions. It can be difficult to make the leap from what I talk about here to what's happening now, but I know it's very much on their minds, and I know what I always try to impart on them, which I think helps with, as we were talking about much earlier, that fetishizing of history, is that every one of us can make a difference, along with the voting, that everyone is unique and has that ability to make a change, and that you don't have to be perfect to do it. So what I always try to do when I'm teaching these students is to say that all of these bewigged ancestors that we're talking about were not perfect people. We tend to think so much about all of these conflicts in terms of good versus evil. As we were saying earlier, the evil British versus the Patriots, and we don't think about the violence that came with that. I know often when I'm talking about the Sons of Liberty, I don't always paint them in the best light. And in addition, talking about something like the abolitionist movement, I've had to convince people in the past that you can be an abolitionist and be a racist at the same time. That's something that people don't think about. That some of the most prominent people in the 18th and 19th centuries who were very adamant for abolition were not actually adamant for equality. Those are two very different things. And so what I try and teach the kids is that they don't have to be perfect and have everything right to be able to change or be able to make a difference.
Wow. Congratulations on that.
That's it. Brian can go.
Jim, you're muted. I'm going to try to unmute you.
Thank you.
There you go.
I was just saying, you got a lot of positive thumbs up and handshakes from on the screen there. I don't know if you saw that, but it was very well said. Brian, you want to get the last comment?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I think we need to, with everything mentioned here, I think we really could use a fundamental rethinking of what local news is. And I think that's like what Elizabeth at Left said, because I'm hearing Charles and hearing Lauren's story, like we're not accomplishing that. We're not getting these stories into the paper or into our websites. But I think that this a nonprofit model for the news could do that, because it wouldn't be bound by chasing advertising dollars and eyeballs, like having to try to get the most likes. And unfortunately, sadly, I have to say, when I was reporting, that the things that got the most likes were not the stories that really meant something. It was like, sensational stuff. Like, it was sad. It was really sad. Like, it made me very depressed to do this job, to see that, just something like a fatal car accident or something would get the most views. And I think too often the commercial model of media forces journalists forces news organizations into this cycle and having to try to get the most eyeballs and to try to get advertising dollars. So I think maybe if we have a fundamental rethinking and like, try to and be able to bring more communities in, those stories should be told. That's not right that the only way that these stories are getting told is enough noise on the internet, and it never, the media cycle never sticks around long enough to make sure that the stories get told the right way before. I mean, there's some excellent like stuff you see like work like the New York Times and them do, but there's not enough staying with something for a time to really get it sorted out before moving on to the next shiny object. And that's what I sort of think.
Super. Brian, thank you.